If you are a front-end developer, you will be creating user interfaces, smooth interactions, and great visuals. But it's likely that at some point you want to create a fully functional app, an app that users can log into, store data, and use on multiple devices. If that's you, keep watching, as this will be your first introduction to back-end development. When you are a front-end developer, you will be writing code for the browser, and the browser mainly understands HTML. So you will start writing your HTML code, and that HTML will consist of other things like CSS, JavaScript, and other assets like font and images. In some way, we have to load this HTML file in the browser. So you will have a browser, and it can be any of your favorite browser. When the browser loads an HTML file, it starts parsing it. While it's parsing it, it will encounter other external files like CSS, JavaScript, and etc. When it encounters those files, it will start loading them separately, but before rendering the whole page. Once everything is ready, then it will start rendering the page. Of course, there are some missing details here. For example, there are assets that are parser plugging and render plugging. But that's not the topic of this video. And in general, this is how the browser works. Now the question is, where does that HTML file come from? And the answer is very simple. It comes from a server. From its name, a server is a computer running some application to serve the clients, and in this case, it's the browser. And in order for the browser to communicate with the server, it has to go through the request-response cycle. So the browser requests something from the server, and the server responds back with what it requested. For example, if you go to the About page by typing the full URL in the address bar, it will send a request to the server asking for the HTML file related to that URL. The server will then process that request and respond back with the HTML file. Now, as the browser parses the HTML file, it will find other assets that it needs to load. For example, style.css. It will again request that file from the server, and the server would respond back with that file. And the same thing happens for other assets. For example, it will ask for a JavaScript file called main.js. It will ask the server about that, and the server will respond back with that file. So here's a live example of how that works. So in this example, I opened apple.com and opened up the network tab. You can see that in the request, we are requesting the homepage of the apple.com, and it sends a GET request. Now, you can see all the information about that request and also the response. For example, you can scroll down to see the response header, like the cache control, the content type, and etc. And also you can see the request header. You can see all the information here. And if you go to the response tab, you will see the HTML file sent back from the server. As mentioned before, you will see that this HTML file will contain other assets to load. For example, you can see it needs to load global header.css, and that's why there is another request for global header.css. It's the same idea. It requests the whole file using the full URL, and it gets back the response, which is a CSS file. And the same thing happens for other assets, for example, a JavaScript file. From the previous example, we can see that a web application has two main parts, the front end and the back end. So in the previous example, we saw how the browser requested the HTML file for the homepage, which was sending a request from the browser to the server after we entered the full URL in the address bar. And then the server responded back with the HTML file. And the same thing happened while we are parsing the HTML file to get other assets like CSS, JavaScript, or images. For most front-end developers, the back-end seems like a black box, something that is really hard to understand. But it's not once you understand the fundamentals of how it works and why we need it. After all, the backend is just a code running on the server to serve the clients. And the word the clients is not specific to the browser. It can be other apps running on other devices communicating with the backend. So it can be a browser, a mobile device, an IoT device, or even another server. In this video, we are more concerned about the browser since we are building web applications. Serving the clients means that the server would take the request to process it and sends back a response. That response can be as an HTML code or other things like a static file. Maybe you are sending back a CSS file or an image. Or it also can be a JSON data or any other thing we want. After all, it's just sending data from the server to the client. In general, the backend is built for two main things. It's either for building a web application or an API, application programming interface. From its name, web application is built for running apps on the browser, and the browser needs an HTML, so its main job is to generate HTML. As simple as it sounds, it involves other things to happen before generating that HTML. Things like storing and querying data from the database, user authentication, handling requests and responses, and providing security for our application. And typically, the front end and the back end would run on the same server in this case. If you've ever built an application before using things like Ruby on Rails or Laravel in PHP, you would be building things using this kind of approach, which means that the front-end code, which includes HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, would exist on the same project as your back-end code. And again, this is for building applications for the browser. If you want to build for other things like a mobile device, then you should go with the other approach, and that is building an API. The main purpose of an API is to expose data to clients. So instead of generating HTML files, you would expose data that the front end would use to display in their user interface. And it's the same as web applications. There are many things involved before exposing that data, like databases, authorization, requests and responses, and security. In this approach, the front end would be running on other server. You can think of building a single page application in React or Vue, where you would be running that application on a different server to communicate with the back end to get it data as JSON data that you can use in the user interface. And again, with this approach, you are free to serve any kind of client you want. Since all we provide here is data, the front end has the choice to do whatever it wants to do with it. Now let's say that we decided to build our front end for the browser. And in this case, the only programming language we can use is JavaScript. And since you are a front end developer, it's most likely that you are familiar with it. But when it comes to the back end, we have many more choices. For example, you can build it using JavaScript, Ruby, Python, PHP, Java, Go, and many other choices. Now, you might be wondering, how is it possible that two different projects can communicate with each other while having two different languages? For example, we will be using JavaScript on the front end, but maybe Ruby on the back end. That simply works because of a protocol created for that, which is the HTTP protocol. It's nothing fancy. All the HTTP protocol does is it provides some conventions that the server and the client can use to communicate with each other. After all they need to send to each other is just some data. So the front end would send a GET request to get some asset from the back end, and the back end would understand that request because it uses the HTTP protocol. Then the back end would send back whatever the client needed from that, using also HTTP protocol as the response. And of course, there are more details you can learn about for the HTTP protocol, but it's beyond the scope of this video. All you need to know is that there is some standard that the back end and the front end use to communicate with each other. As we just saw, there are many options when it comes to building backend. But for most front-end developers, it's recommended to stick with JavaScript as it will be the language that they are most familiar with. But to be able to use the JavaScript on the backend, we need to have a runtime on the server. And there are many options nowadays. For example, we have the most popular one, Node.js, we have DNL, and the most recent one, Bun. Since Node.js is the most popular one and it has a mature ecosystem, we'll be using Node.js to build a simple backend application at the end of this video. But before that, let's answer the most important question, which is why even using a backend? After all, we can have our front end served by other third-party services that we don't even have to implement. But when you learn how to build the backend app, you will be able to implement more capabilities for your web application. For example, you can have data persistence, for example, a database. If you only have a front-end application, you can store your data in things like local storage or cookies. But that's not practical, as it will be cleared once you clear the data of your browser or even open up a different web browser. And most importantly, this data is only stored locally on your device. But when you have a backend, the data will be residing on a different server that all users can use. Authentication and authorization is one of the most important aspects of building a backend application. When you have a backend, then you can make your users log into your app and even see what permissions they have to know what actions they can do and what actions they can't. Server-side rendering. When you build a single-page application, your user interface will be created by the browser. And that means without JavaScript, your application wouldn't be displayed. And that would hurt the SEO of your site. That's why you would see a lot of people recommending building your app with a server-side rendering in mind. Which means, in simple terms, that your user interface, your HTML file, will be created on the server instead of on the browser. And when you have that, then it will be easy for the search engine crawlers to inspect your code and display it in their search results. It's not only good for SEO but also for performance, as it will be able to cache the response instead of waiting for the browser to build the whole user interface after loading the JavaScript and CSS files. Another reason is that your users will be able to upload files and store them on the cloud. Security is a very important one, as there will be no way for the user to bypass some restrictions by manipulating how the browser works. For example, validating data on the server is much more reliable than on the browser, although it's a best practice to have both for a better user experience. Not only that, but you'll also be able to encrypt the data before storing them, especially when it comes to passwords and other important things. And you'll be able to process things in the background. For example, you can offload very intensive tasks from the front end to the back end to keep the front end much more interactive and responsive. Other important things you can do in the background are like logging errors and events, as well as scheduling some actions to happen in the future, such as sending emails or notifications. And lastly, we can do cross-origin requests. It's very likely that you encountered the error course while communicating with the server from the browser. While this is needed in the browser to protect the user from some security issues, it's not needed on the backend. So sometimes you would find people using the backend as a proxy to communicate with third-party APIs. So in my opinion, when it comes to communicating with a third-party API, it's better to put that code on the backend, so you can hide all this sensitive information like secret keys. I think that's enough for theory. Now let's jump onto code to learn how to build a very simple Node application for sending a static HTML file, and then we'll learn how to generate an HTML file using some template engine, and finally we'll learn how to build a JSON API endpoint. Before you jump in to create your first Node app, make sure you have Node installed on your system. You can simply go to nodejs.org and you can install the LTS version simply by clicking on this and following the instructions. So now here we are in an empty project. Let's start by creating a package.json file. We can do that simply by calling npm init and y. For this app, we're going to use the Express Web Framework, which is a very popular framework for creating Node apps. We can install it by saying npm install express. First, let's create the HTML file that we will serve to the client. Let's call it posts.html. For this example, I'm going to use this HTML. So I just pasted this HTML that we should serve to the client. And you can see I wrote the word static page because this is a static page that we just would serve as is. Now let's create the web server. To create that, we need to create a new JS file. Let's call it index.js. First, we need to import a few things and start a new app. So you can see we are requiring the express function to create a new app, and we imported a path module for working with paths, as you'll see in a little bit. Next, we need to run the app on a certain port. We can do that by calling app.listen and specifying the port here. So it will be 3000. And we are just logging some message that says the app is running on this link. Now we come to the fun part. Now we need to create a request handler for a certain URL path. In this case, I just need to serve the root path, which means the home page. So we define that using app.get. In this case, it's called get because it's a get request. And then we specify the path here. And in the callback, we have two objects that we can use. One for reading the request information and one for responding. For this example, all we need to do is just to send the post.html file back. And we can do that using this. So we can use the REST object to send the file and specifying the path for that HTML file like this. To run that app, all we have to do is to call node and the name of that file, which is index.js. You can now see that it says the app is running on this link. So let's go to that link and see what we have. Cool, and that works. You can see that now we are serving the HTML file that we defined here. In this example, we implemented a static HTML file endpoint, which means that we just send the HTML file as is without changing its content. But in most cases, we need to use the HTML file as a template that we can provide data for. So for example, instead of having the posts defined statically here, we should pass an array of posts that will be rendered here. To do that, let's start by adding that array here. So it's going to be called posts, and it contains the 4 elements like this. Next, instead of calling the send file on the response object, we will call the method render. And also, instead of serving the posts.html, we will serve a posts file but with a different extension. And let's just remove the .html for now. And now in the second argument, we will pass the posts array. So we can say posts, or just posts. So now in the posts file, we will have access to an array with the key posts. But now the question is what that posts file is now. Now it's not an HTML. It should be using some templating engine. And templating engines is just a very simple concept where instead of defining the HTML file directly, you define another file type that will be compiled to an HTML file before sending the response. There are many options to choose for a templating engine, but in this example, I'm gonna use the EJS templating engine. To install it, run npm install EJS. And to use it, we need to tell the Express app about it. So we can say app.set the view engine to EJS. This also means we need to modify the posts.html to posts.ejs. First, I'm gonna rename this from static page to dynamic page. And I'm going to replace the list tags with this code. Don't worry if this looks confusing. We are just using the EJS syntax that they have. You can learn about it on ejs.co. But basically what we are doing here is that we are looping through the posts array, and for each post we are displaying it directly in a list tag. Now let's save this and rerun the app to see what we will have. Let's reload, and now we have dynamic page with these elements. Let's, for example, try to modify the second one to make it 22, reload the app again, and reload the page. You can see how it's now updated. Now the last type of app we will create is a JSON API, which means that when you go to the home page, we will retain a JSON data for the posts array. And let's see how to do it. Now instead of rendering the page, we will just return a JSON data and send the posts data in an object. Now we no longer need the view engine settings here or the path module. If we save and run the app, if you reload here, you will see now we are returning a JSON data. Now for this type of app, you can have the front end running on a different server. And then you can communicate with the backend app using, for example, an AJAX request to fetch the JSON data and use it however you want. So that's it for this video. Becoming a backend developer is a lot of work. All I did here is I showed you how the basic workflow of communicating between the front end and the back end is. So you still have a lot of things to learn here. For example, how can we create a database and connect it to this app? And how can we authenticate a user to make them log in to the app? And in this example, we have just a single file. But in real world, it's not practical to put all of your code in a single file, so you need to learn about how to architect your back-end application. But all of these are beyond the scope of this video. If you are interested in learning more about these topics, let me know in the comments of this video. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching.